The title of class today is Issues in Human Ecology. It's the second class, How to Respond to the Challenges of Our Biological Nature. In the first class, I talked a little bit about what does ecology say about us as a human species, and how does that relate exactly to how we can design, how we can understand the problems that we are facing, whether it be ecological problems, social problems, all of these problems that community development projects try to relate to, is important to frame them correctly. Because when the projects are not framed, when the problem is not framed correctly, the interventions, the community projects are not going to be well designed, are not going to be well developed, etc. And I think that, from my perspective, I think that human ecology, the study of humans as a part of an ecosystem that depends on the natural world, has a lot that can teach us about how we can frame the problems we understand. So in the first part of this class, I'm gonna do a real quick overview about what we looked at in the first class. But it's basically about what is that? What does human ecology teach us about the problems that we are experiencing, that the holes that we have dug ourselves into? But in this second class, I'm gonna focus a lot more on how we can respond to the challenges that our biological nature has helped to create. The class outline, like I said, I'm going to start with a quick overview of the evolutionary and biological basis of our predicament. Obviously, human ecology is the study of the relationship of different organisms that share a physical space and the relationship to the environment that sustains. Um, and I start from the basic evolutionary idea that human beings are animals. We are mammals descended from primates, and we are subject to the same laws of nature, the same laws of evolution, the same laws of competitive advantage that every other species is subject to. And because of that, and because of the fact that our society, especially our modern day civilization, has forgotten that truism, we have dug ourselves into some pretty serious issues. And so what we looked at last time was that things like climate change and biodiversity loss, a lot of these issues that are kind of the fundamental ecological issues of our age stem back to this very fact that we are a part of nature and that we've forgotten that we have forgotten that we have to create a society that abides by the laws, the evolutionary laws, biological basis of who we are. So I'm going to do a real quick overview of that. Then I'm going to look at the idea that human culture, the cultures that we create, the societies that we create, can either be a maladaptive evolutionary trait or an adaptive evolutionary trait. So when I say adaptive and maladaptive, those are words that biologists use to say that when a certain species develops a characteristic or a trait or a gene that does not help it compete and survive well in its place, then it is considered to have a maladaptive trait, and that eventually leads to the extinction or a radical reduction in the population numbers of that species. So human culture, what we do together as communities, can be either an adaptive or maladaptive. What we looked at in the first class is that generally, unfortunately, human cultures, especially the modern day culture we live in today, is a maladaptive trait. It's pushing us towards extinction, pushing us towards population reduction, towards collapse, you could say. But human culture can also be an adaptive evolutionary trait. An adaptive trait, in terms of biology, is that which allows a species to flourish. It's a trait that allows a certain species to take advantage of a niche within its environment, to reproduce, to be a healthy part of a healthy ecosystem. And human culture, I think, can be seen as an adaptive evolutionary trait. And there's nowhere better to see that than in indigenous groups, indigenous cultures, indigenous communities that have lived for thousands of years in these different, different parts of their ancestral territories. And I think when we look at Western civilization, even though that all of us have been born into modernity, modernity is very, very young. The Industrial Revolution's been going on for 250 or 300 years. Ancestral indigenous cultures have lived in places sometimes for up to 5, 6, 10,000 years. So the proof of their existence is in their length of cohabitation with the place. They have learned to sustain in a place. They have learned to create cultures that allow them to adapt and thrive within their places. And if we're going to learn how human cultures can be an adaptive trait, we need to look at them. So we're going to look at a few interesting examples of indigenous cultures around the world and how they can teach us how to create human cultures that are truly sustainable, regenerative. And then we're going to look at four other kind of more modern day thinkers that come from the Western tradition that have a lot to say about how culture can become an adaptive trait. We're going to look at Daniel Wall, who wrote an interesting book called Regenerative Cultures. Jeremy Lent, he writes a lot about the development and maintenance of ecological civilizations. We're going to look at the idea of original instructions. This kind of goes back to indigenous groups. What are original instructions? Where do they come from, and how does that apply to our society today? And then lastly, I want to end kind of looking at one of my famous authors that I've shared in most classes, John Michael Greer. And he has an idea called nature as negative feedback and how that can help us and how we need that, how our modern day society has grown away from any sort of close relationship to nature that allows us to receive negative feedback. And at the very end, I'm gonna leave you all with a few questions that hopefully we can have a short discussion, about 10-15 minutes about that. So yeah, let's start with this one. The quick overview of the evolutionary or biological basis of our predicament. I use that word, I think, purposely, predicament versus problem. From our mindset, when we hear the word problem, we think, well, a problem requires a solution, right? If there's something wrong, then we will come up with a way to deal with it, to fix it, whatever it might be. And so when you think about climate change, well, the way to fix that is, we either transition to solar panels and wind turbines, or if that doesn't work, then we're going to start with some sort of geoengineering projects. We'll shoot some big mirrors into space and reflect sunlight back into it. That's the idea. That when we see a problem, that's how we react to it. We want a solution, and generally, we want a scientific solution, a technological solution. When we say the word predicament, predicament implies that there is not necessarily a solution. You have to live with the predicament. You don't solve it. It requires behavioral change. It requires different ways for us to react to the predicament while not necessarily getting rid of it. So if we can say that part of our ancestral heritage as animals, as mammals, is that we have to live within the certain laws that nature requires. That's a predicament. That doesn't mean we can do whatever we want. It requires us to accept certain limitations, certain restraint, certain certain limitations to this desire that consumes humanity of wanting to have everything. And if you look at this picture here, this is a basic picture of every high school student who's studying biology will probably do the student. You take a little bit of either bacteria or a little bit of yeast. You put it into a petri dish, and you start feeding it sugar or some sort of glucose, and the bacteria or the yeast or whatever you have in that petri dish respond to that abundance of resources that is in their environment. Their environment in this case is the petri dish. And if you put some resources in it, they're going to start to consume them. As they see there's this abundance of food. And so they start to reproduce and consume more and consume more. But obviously the bacteria or the yeast do not understand that everything in their world is right here in this petri dish. And once they consume the sugar or the glucose or whatever you're feeding them, once they consume them, there's no other place to get more. There's no more space for them to continue to expand upon. And so what happens? You get what they call the famous S curve, where it goes up. The population responds to the abundance of resources by reproducing, by consuming more until that resource is gone. There's no more space to expand, and what you have is a collapse of population. This S curve, this growth and then collapse, is something that occurs all the time in nature. It occurs from petri dishes to mammals that inhabit new territories, new geographies. And the question is that are we as human beings different from this? Are we simply adapted to be an animal that consumes all of the resources that are available to us until there are no more and then we collapse? Are we as modern day industrial human beings going to simply see the earth as our petri dish and we're just going to eat up everything we can, consume all we can until it's gone, and then we're going to collapse? Or do we have the ability to use our evolutionary advantage, which is our brain and the cultures we create, to understand what bacteria and yeast cannot understand? Bacteria and yeast cannot understand that there are limitations to this petri dish. We do have the ability to see that. And we could say, well, it'd be really smart of these bacteria and yeast to, set up limitations to how much they can reproduce or how much they can consume so that they can continue on living. But obviously they can't do that. We can. So some evolutionary biologists say that the human being, the human species, is a mammal, but we can also be a keystone species, that we are evolved to consume all of the available resources that we find in our natural habitats. With globalization, our natural habitat is not limited to space. Our natural habitat is the earth. We have people living in deserts and the Arctic regions and rainforests and every available ecosystem. So we are evolved to do that. But um, uh, is that predetermined, I guess, is the question. E.O. Wilson, who's one of the most famous biologists of modern times, said that one of the problems that with modern day human beings is that we have Paleolithic emotions. That means that our brains evolved in the Paleolithic times. We, as a human species, spent millions of years, as hunter and gatherer species. But in recent times, we've developed medieval institutions. The governments, the corporations that rule our world are the same ones that grew out, 500 years ago during the medieval years. But now we have godlike technology. So we don't have the correct emotional ability, the correct cognitive ability to understand, and our institutions are not well enough to develop to deal with this idea that we have this godlike technology to consume everything that is available to us. Our brains evolved for millions of years to respond to the challenges of life on the African savanna. That's where humanity came from. The evolution of our reflective capability, our ability to think about our predicament, has not necessarily kept up with our technological capabilities, right? So when we pull out of the ground all of the oil and all of the coal and all of the resources that we need, that's kind of like this evolutionary impulse that we have, from 2 million years. A hunter and gatherer on the African savanna comes across, this huge tree with an enormous amount of fruit. We're going to consume as much as we can because we don't know if tomorrow we're going to find the next tree. And we still have that's something inherent in our genes still today, right? So the question is, can we advance beyond that to a sense where we use our brain, use our cultures, to understand that we don't have an unlimited amount of resources anymore, right? This one-time windfall of concentrated energy in the form of fossil fuels has put us on a collision course with collapse, because suddenly, we're not necessarily just confined to these small pockets of civilization, right? So, the Egyptian civilization rose and fell, the Roman civilization rose and fell, the Mayan civilizations in the part of the Central America where I live rose and fell. But now what we have is, because of the discovery of oil and coal and natural gas and all of that came with it, all of the scientific discoveries that have come since the industrial and scientific revolutions, that doesn't last either. That is also a finite resource. And here I shared this quote in last class. I'm going to share it again because it's the negative aspect of the quote here, or the negative aspect of kind of some evolutionary biologists think that we do not have the ability to use culture as an adaptive trait. So the negative view says Homo sapiens has evolved to reproduce exponentially, expand geographically, and consume all available resources. For most of humanity's evolutionary history, such expansionist tendencies have always been countered by negative feedback, right? So if you live in a tiny valley, along the Nile River, in northern Egypt, you can consume, you can reproduce, you can expand up to a certain point, right? And when the soil starts to degrade, when the waters change, when the climate changes, when there's too much population pressure on a place, those communities rose and collapsed. But what happened today is, because of our globalized nature, because of fossil fuels, because of the scientific revolution, we have kind of avoided that negative feedback. However, the scientific revolution and the use of fossil fuels reduced many forms of negative feedback. This idea that, once we use the resources, we pay the consequences, right? And this has enabled us to realize our full potential for exponential growth. So in the last 100 years, our population has spiked. Our resource use has spiked. It's all of these, when you look at, if you Google hockey stick graphs, there's all these things that, there's this very, very small upward trend until about 100 years ago, and then all of a sudden, boom, this algorithmic super fast growth, right? But this natural capacity of human beings to reproduce and expand and consume is being reinforced by today's culture, which is growth-oriented neoliberal economics, and that is putting us on a path towards collapse. That's what Bill Reese, who's one of the leading human ecologists in the world today, that's his view. It's a negative view. But like I said, the other side of the coin is that human culture can be considered an adaptive evolutionary trait, and it has been. There are obviously lots of examples throughout history of civilizations that rose and fell. The Roman Empire, the Egyptian Empire, certain empires in Far East Asia, certain large city empires in Central America, in South America, in Africa. There's lots of examples of that, but there are also lots of examples of smaller scale human settlements that have existed for thousands of years, that haven't gone through this path of growth and collapse, that have sustained a generally small scale human enterprise that subsists within the boundaries of the local geography of the local ecosystems. So growth-oriented neoliberal economics, what today dominates our modern day system, our modern day culture, is just one cultural possibility open to our species. We can decide what type of society we want to create. So many indigenous and agrarian communities throughout history, culture has acted as a negative feedback enforcer. The cultural institutions, the norms, the laws, the traditions, the celebrations, etc., that we create have evolved to try and stimulate local communities to respect the local ecosystem, to respect nature, to respect the limitations that are necessary for us to continue to thrive, right? And that allows communities to live and continue to subsist within the boundaries and restraints of their supporting ecosystem. So here's a few examples. So the one that I've always used that I find the most famous was that there was a famous agronomist from the United States back in, I think it was the 1920s, and he had been studying his entire life about how U.S. farmers in the United States, moved into an area, started plowing up the fields, farming corn and beans. And after about two generations, or maybe even one generation sometimes, the land was completely barren. After tilling up these prairies, and then there's erosion, and then the wind carries away the soil. And after 30 years, the farmers have to move on to another piece of land because they've effectively ruined the soil, which is the basis of what they need to survive, right? And then after, when he was about 60, this agronomist called F.H. King took a trip to China. And he found that there were these communities that had been growing rice, on these terraced rice paddies. They had learned a way of flooding the fields. They also had learned a way of returning all of the natural excrement from human communities, from their animals, all of the organic wastes into their fields. And what he had found was these were farmers of 40 centuries. 40 generations, 80 generations of people had been farming the same piece of land without ruining the fertility of the soil, without destroying the ecological basis of their civilization. Obviously, once the soil goes, then you can no longer have a culture based on rice growing, right? And he wrote this, the conclusion to his book, which is called Farmers of 40 Centuries. It says, I have traveled from practices in the United States where 3 generations had exhausted strong virgin fields to others in China that are still fertile after 30 centuries of cropping. That's not just a difference in how you farm. It's not just a difference in farming techniques. It's a difference in culture, about how a certain culture responds to what nature provides. So from the United States perspective, these farmers come in, they see these really great fertile topsoils, and they just rape the soil. They use as much of it as can until it's gone. Whereas the other cultural example is China. The Chinese farmers learned to understand that there were limitations to how much you could take from the soil. There were limitations to how much you could grow, and there were requirements about how to refertilize those fields so that they could continue. So that's one example. Another interesting, I think, example of how indigenous cultures can teach us about how to create a culture that is an adaptive evolutionary trait is the fact that most indigenous languages around the world, obviously not all, but most, do not have a traditional word for the idea work. There's a famous sociologist that did a lot of study amongst tribes in the Amazonian basin in South America, and he wrote that the economic behavior of most of the tribes in the Amazon is organized by means that are completely different from capitalist production and market transaction. And so one of the examples of that is that while he was working in these forests, in these tropical forests, there were some missionaries that came and they saw all of these Amazonian tribes that were working with stone tools, right? They hadn't benefited uh, benefited from the introduction of metals. And so what they did is these missionaries brought in metal axes and they said, hey, look, with this new tool that we give you, you can cut down much faster, the firewood that you need, the wood you need to build your homes, the wood you need to build your canoes. But what happened was that the idea of these Western missionaries was that the indigenous people were going to be more productive. They were going to use this new tool to work faster, to work harder, to extract more from the local ecosystem. But what happened was what they did not do 10 times the amount of work. Obviously, if you have a metal axe compared to a stone axe, you can do, let's say, 10 times more the work. But the indigenous tribes of the Amazon did not do 10 times the amount of work, but they did the same amount of work in 10 times less. They decided with this new tool, this is great. They accepted the metal axes, but what they did is they worked to get as much wood as they needed for their homes, for their canoes, for fishing, for their firewood. And then they rested more time. They had more time for the community, more time for family, more time for celebration. And the indigenous or the missionaries were confused by this because, like, there was this idea, oh, well, then the Indians, the indigenous people, must be lazy. And so this idea that no, the people understood that they needed that there were certain amounts of limitations of what they could take from the forest, right? And they took what they needed, but they didn't take more. And so the introduction of a new tool was accepted in they were accepted happily, but they used it so that they could spend more time in rest and relaxation and family and community, etc. Another example, one that I find fascinating, was here in Guatemala, where I lived for about 7 years. There's a small community of Mayan Quiche indigenous people called Totonicapan. And Totonicapan has become a fast urbanized area. As the population has grown, it's grown into a huge town. It's not a little village anymore. But outside the entire town, surrounding, kind of circling the town and around the mountains, is this beautiful old growth pine and cedar forest. It's a forest that's been protected for thousands and thousands of years by the indigenous people that live there. And they have a very, very strong cultural attachment to the forest. And they have very strict community rules about what can be used. So the community forest isn't owned by any individual. It's not owned by the government. It's owned by the community itself. And there's a council of elders that is elected every year that determines who can go into the forest, how much wood can be harvested each year by each family. So each family has a quota. If they need one or two trees so that one of their children can build a house, they're allowed to go in there anymore, but there's a limit. You can't take more than one or two trees per year. Everybody in the community has to dedicate a certain amount of days per year doing work in the forest. So doing things to replant the forest. They do a lot with fire breaks to help control any fire outbreaks that might happen. They patrol the forest to make sure that nobody else, from the outside the community comes in is illegally logging the forest. And any family that does not participate in those tasks is first of all is not allowed to harvest the wood for their own needs, and secondly, all of the water comes from this forest. All of the water that goes into the city obviously comes from springs that are fed by the forest. And if one family decides that they're not going to participate, the community goes and they turn off their water supply, and that's a pretty quick way to obligate, to force people to participate in the necessary tasks related to taking care of a very, very important ecosystem, right? And so the idea, this is an example of a community that has understood the importance of the natural world that sustains them. The forest gives them food. It gives them obviously a water supply. It gives them fuel. It gives them lumber for building their homes. But that requires limitations. It requires participation. And community norms and laws and governance structures have been created around that. And that's based on this idea that the community well-being trumps individual profit and interest, and the well-being of the supportive ecosystem trumps community desire. So there's kind of this pyramid, right? At the top of the pyramid is the natural ecosystem, because if that goes, everything goes. Underneath that is the community, and at the bottom of the pyramid is the individuals. So there's all these cultural enforcers for proper relationship to the land that sustains. Another very, very important aspect of indigenous culture is religion. And I'm not religion. When we hear that, we might think of Christianity or Islam or many of the world's largest religions. But religion, is a shared ideological belief by a group of people. And Edward Goldsmith, who is one of the human ecologists, one of the original people who started the study of human ecology, he looked at all of these indigenous groups, and they all had their shared religion, their shared spirituality, their shared kind of cosmovision of the world. And he said this shared religion acted as a control mechanism of these stable societies that didn't grow and consume all of the resources. Religion was kind of the one that maintained it. It was the glue that held people together. And one of this really interesting examples is the Guarani people of what modern day Paraguay, parts of Brazil, and parts of Argentina. They were one of the largest indigenous groups when the Spanish missionaries and Portuguese missionaries arrived to this part of the world. They found one of the largest indigenous groups in all of the Americas. But one of the things that they couldn't understand is that, this group, they had millions of people spread out across the forest. And there were little tiny communities in every part of the forest. And they had a very, very well-developed religion. They had fantastic cultural, they were some of the best musicians of the world. In fact, the Jesuits taught them how to play all of these traditional European musical instruments. But they had culture, they had population growth, but they didn't have state. They never had a city. There was never this like concentration of people, which is what you would think of civilization. And one of the reasons that they didn't have that, what they discovered was that the Guarani religion had this idea of the land without evil. And the land of evil was whenever a certain amount of people grouped together. And that's when evil started to come up. And so they're always looking for how to create this land without evil. And there was this idea of there's a certain limitation to how big human communities can become, right? So if you grow to, maybe we can live in a land without evil if there's 1,000 families living together. But once we get to 10,000 families, then evil starts to creep in. Then you need states. Then you need government. Then you need, all of these different ideas of how to control that. And to avoid that, what the Guarani did is every time a community grew to a certain level, a part of them would split off and go somewhere else into the forest, and they create a new community. And so they created this fantastic civilization that did not have cities, that didn't have a concentration of people. And that came from essentially a religious impulse, this idea, religiosity that was shared by a large group of people. So those are just a few examples of indigenous cultures. And I think that if we're going to be honest with ourselves, it's the Indians, it's the indigenous people that have more to share with us about how we can live in proper relationship to our place, and how culture can act, like I said, as an enforcer of the negative feedback to make sure that we exist within the bounds that nature creates. Um, but obviously, today there are other thinkers, people from the Western tradition that have interesting ideas, and one of them is Jeremy Lent. He's written a couple books. One is called The Patterning Instinct, and he writes a lot about this idea of how to create ecological civilization. And he starts this book, I think it's fascinating, with a story that we are not often told in history class, right? When we think, especially here in the part of the world where I live in, When we talk about world history, we talk about 1492, which was the year that Christopher Columbus sailed across the ocean from Spain and started to conquer the New World, right? And shortly after that, there were Portuguese explorers, or shortly before that, sorry, Portuguese explorers that started to conquer the continent of Africa. But one of the things that we don't hear is before this impulse of conquest, of violence, genocide led by European nations. In 1405, there was a Chinese admiral called Admiral Zheng. And in 1405, so about 100 years before Columbus, he set off from China with the greatest armada in history. He had 300 huge ships, and he traveled for 30 years to Africa, to Asia, to different islands in the Pacific. Um, and there was this massive ship. Later that century, in 1492, Columbus, he sailed with three tiny, barely seaworthy boats. So there's a huge difference between these two armadas, right? Zheng, this incredibly powerful 300 strong ship navy. Columbus had three boats and a crew who was probably starving to death by the time they made it to the islands in the Caribbean. But what happened was that Zheng's armada, for all its grandeur, left virtually no imprint on world history, while Columbus changed the entire course of history. Admiral Zheng went to these areas and he explored, he opened opportunities for trade, he discussed, it was a learning expedition. They wanted to learn about different areas of the world, but there was not this idea of conquest. There was not this idea of violence. And even though he had so much more military power, military resources, he could have essentially taken over Africa and other parts of Asia and islands. They did not do that. And so Jeremy Lent starts his book, and he says, why does that happen? Why did Columbus start this path of colonization and Admiral Zheng did not? It's because culture shapes values, and those values shape history. The cultural values of ancient China were much different from the cultural values of Europe in the 15th century and the 16th centuries. Those values were a place that was teeming with people that needed place to expand, and they used violence, the worst types of violence, to colonize Africa, to colonize the Americas, to enslave people, to start the slave trade. Whereas China, in 1405, did not do that. And obviously Admiral Zheng did not discover America. He didn't make it across the ocean. But Lent says that it's fair to assume that even if he had discovered America, the Chinese would not have conquered the New World. They would not have set up these institutions of slavery, of expropriation of lands, et cetera, because they were driven by fundamentally different set of motivations than those that the European explorers had, right? And so if we're going to talk about creating ecological civilizations, which is what Jeremy Layton writes about in his book, we need to start from this idea of what are the values that stem from the culture we have. And I think it's fairly safe to say that the values that are behind modern day techno-industrial culture are not values that are going to shape a good history for our species, right? We need to change the values. We need to change the values from growth, from consumption, from consumer-driven values to one of living happily within bounds, to sharing, to accepting a certain stable state instead of always wanting more and more and more. Daniel Wall is another interesting Western-based thinker. He wrote a book 10 years ago, maybe now, called Designing Regenerative Cultures. He did a lot of work looking at indigenous cultures as well. And he says that I believe that one of the core upstream organizing ideas that drives a lot of unsustainable patterns downstream is a conceptual belief that somehow nature and culture separate, that somehow we as human beings have become different from the natural world, that through our technologies, through our power of technologies, we have now grown outside of the natural system, and that nature is no longer a part of us. We are no longer a part of nature. It is simply a resource base, something that we use to extract what we need. If we really want to work regeneratively, we have to understand that human beings, that we are expressions of life, and that life is a planetary process as well as a process involving lots of different species in individuals. And one whole chapter of his book talks about how what we need to do, one of the most important things that humanity needs to do, is to learn from nature's patterns. This idea of biomimicry, right? So different, mimicry is something that happens in nature. One species imitates another. We need to take that on. We need to look at how the natural world operates, and we need to try to mimic that in our culture, in our institutions, in our economic lives, right? Um, so if we move, one of the things that a lot of people ask when we talk about these issues, okay, so what are some practical examples? What can we do practically to change this, to change these cultural values that we have? And one of the things that I think is safe to say is that there is no blueprint, there is no set of instructions that everybody has to follow. Learning to live within the boundaries of nature, learning to create culture that can be an adaptive trait is going to be something that responds to each and every individual geography, each and every individual place. What's going to work in a certain part of Africa is going to be very, very different than what works in Central America, right? What works in a Arctic ecosystem is going to be fundamentally different than what works in a tropical ecosystem, right? But generally, here are some, very, very general principles that I think that can help us. Sustainability should no longer be the goal. I don't think we can sustain the modern day civilization that we have. We need to go beyond that. We need cultural expressions that regenerate the damage that our species has already caused. It's kind of like this idea with global climate change. It's not enough anymore to just to stop pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. They've talked about what can we do to start to capture that, right? To try and reverse the damage we have done over the last 300-400 years. One of the things is that in every part of the world, we need to eat. People need to eat. That's kind of one of the fundamental basis of our humanity. And we need to try and find agricultural practices that restore the soil. Because when soil is restored, carbon is captured. When soil is restored and carbon is captured, habitat is created for animals. And this kind of creates, a biodiversity positive feedback loop that we need to follow. And so everywhere we need to go, we need to see the soil as a resource, not to exploit, not to extract, like that first example that we talked about, but as a resource that we need to replenish, right? Kind of like the Chinese did, the farmers of 40 centuries. In my own personal experience, one of the best ways to do that is to try to help farmers, rural communities transition to perennial agricultural systems that focus on agroforestry. That's something that has always existed throughout almost all indigenous traditions, and we need to relearn how to do that. Another example, one I want to do a class on sometime later this year, is the production of biochar. Biochar is this kind of it's a it's not a new technology, but people are finding ways to use technology to improve the efficiency of it. But biochar is essentially turning any sort of agricultural refuse, any type of waste material, organic material, into charcoal. Charcoal is one of the most stable forms of carbon. When you create biochar, when you create charcoal, you're essentially extracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it in charcoal, which will last for thousands of years. Biochar can also be used to improve soil, and there's all these different types of uses for it. So there's an example, for example, of how modern technologies, can be utilized to regenerate the natural ecosystems. And then there's all these other different ideas. How can we use, as humanity, our ability to transform things? We are one of the few species, outside maybe beavers and some others, that really have the ability to use technology to transform ecosystems. And so one of the, here are a few examples. We have dammed in North America almost all of the major rivers, and salmon, which, spawn. They come from the oceans and they fly up these rivers where they can lay their eggs. Most of them can no longer do that because all the rivers are dammed. So there's all this movement in certain parts of North America to regenerate the waterways, essentially take away these dams that are no longer useful so that the natural world can start this again. How can we rehabilitate the food chains that we've ruined? There's a famous biological example of simply reintroducing a keystone species such as wolves into an important ecological area, which was Yellowstone, and the wolves started to cull the population of elk and moose and deer, and that allowed the natural trees to regenerate. The beavers started cutting down some of those trees to make dams, to make flooded waterways. And there was this cascade effect of positive environmental effects that happened because human beings understood. We used our knowledge to try and regenerate an ecosystem. Another thing that I think is very important is that there's this myth, I think, that maybe I fed into this, that indigenous peoples have this kind of mythical connection with the natural world. But no, indigenous peoples, I think they have a cosmological myth, creation stories that always contain some sort of original instructions that tell how we need to live in right relationship to the territory. And where did these original instructions come from? They arose from the impetus of destruction and ecological devastation, and what we learned from that. So, for the example, in almost every part of the world, when human beings left Africa 2 million years ago, there's this very very clear pattern that once we went into Asia, once we went into Australia, once we made our way across the land bridge and came into North America and Central America, the first thing that happened was that we killed off all of the megafauna, the mammoths. Here in Central America, there used to be a huge population of giant sloths, giant armadillos, these massive mammals that had evolved after the dinosaurs went extinct. And human beings, once we came into this area, we're like, damn, look at these big animals, and they were easy to kill because they were slow, and they didn't reproduce because they were at the top of the food chain. They didn't reproduce very fastly. In over a couple generations, they were gone. And indigenous cultures, I think, saw that and learned from that. And so they created this cultural, religious expression. A lot of times that's tied up in their creation stories, that's tied up in this idea of original instructions, how not to do this again. Okay, we've learned, we came into an ecosystem that we didn't understand. We ruined it. We killed off some species, unfortunate species that are never going to come back. There's never going to be giant sloths in Central America again. But the indigenous cultures learned from that, tried to change their practices, tried to learn different ways to react healthfully to that, right? So here in Central America, we don't have any creation stories about how to take care of the giant sloths, but there's all of these deeply held cosmological myths about how to take care of the soil, because that's where the corn comes from. We are the culture of the corn. And so there's all these ideas about what we need to do, what communities need to do to protect one of the most important resources. And I think a question that we need to ask ourselves, those of us who grew up in Western society, modern day techno-industrial world, okay, we've came into an ecosystem which was a globalized world with our technology, with our power, and we've ruined it. We're ruining it, causing global climate change, biodiversity loss, loss of topsoil. Now it's time for us to stop and create our own original instructions. What can we learn from that destruction process? What type of cosmology can we create together that will allow that not to happen again in the future, right? I think that we need to have some sort of original instructions for our modern day species. Um, One more thing, and then I'm going to be done because we're running out of time, and I want to leave some space for questions. Is John Michael Greer, in his book The Retro Future, has this fantastic example called nature as negative feedback. And here's a quote from what he said. He says that human mental models, what we think of the world, these ideas that we create when we see the natural world and we participate in it, and the civilizations that we create from that, are what you get when you take the universe and you dumb it down to the point that our minds can more or less grasp it. The universe, the ecologies in which we live, are extremely complex and difficult to understand. But we try and create these models that dumb it down so we can grasp it, right? What keeps our models from becoming completely dysfunctional, or what keeps our civilizations from becoming completely dysfunctional and eventually collapsing, is the negative feedback we get from the universe, from the biological systems that sustain us. Negative feedback is an evolutionary concept that when we do something and it leads to negative consequences, it allows us to shift, to transition, to change our behaviors. Animals do this all the time. When they get negative feedback, they start to evolve, they start to change patterns of behavior, sometimes even change their physical bodies to respond to this negative feedback. Thus, we absolutely need to root human cultures, human communities in physical territories where we can feel and experience and learn from the natural world. One of the things that the most damaging things that I think has happened to our world today is that we have extracted ourselves from the natural world, right? Most of us buy stuff online. We go to supermarkets. We go to the mall. We turn on a switch to have electricity in our home, and we have no idea where that stuff comes from. We don't know where the food we purchase comes from most of the time. When we turn on the electricity, we don't know where that, where the carbon was, or where the coal was mined, where the oil was burned. When we flush our toilets, most of us don't know, what happens to our own human waste. Where is it going? What sort of contamination is creating? And when we don't have that direct connections with the natural world, it's almost impossible to feel the negative feedback, right? If you live in a small community, and if the whole community is putting all of their human waste, putting poop into the river, sooner or later people are going to start to get sick. That's an example of natural feedback, of negative feedback, and people are going to start to make changes. But when we extricate ourselves, when we extract ourselves from the natural world, it's hard to see those externalities, especially on a personal basis. And I think that what we need is we need to create cultures that can accept and understand this negative feedback, right? So that we can feel what happens when we act, so that we can see what happens when our growth economy, and when we try to grow and grow and grow, what happens? We need to see, we need to feel, we need to participate in the actions, or the consequences of our actions. That's what responsibility is, right? Is being able to respond to what we do. And I think that globalization, one of the biggest damages of that is that we're not able to respond to it because we don't know, we don't see that negative feedback. Okay, it's been 45 minutes now, so I'm just gonna read these three questions, and I'm gonna leave it open for questions. I'm gonna ask the moderator from AIU if she can help me taking questions from people. You can either do it in the chat or you can just raise your hand, whatever you want. But here are the three questions. What cultural shifts might allow for new values to emerge that place human individuals and communities in right relationship with the natural world that sustains? That's just the first question. Second one, what might be an example in your own community of biomimicry, wherein human communities learn to, to design settlements, economies, human ideas that can thrive in the natural world? And thirdly, in what ways could our species, our human species, put our penchants, our ability for technology to the service of regenerating the natural world that we have degraded? So I'm going to leave those questions up there. And yeah, I would ask whoever's leading the AIU. I didn't see what it was this morning. If she could help me organize the questions. So I'd love to hear from you all for the next 10, 15 minutes if we could.